Here's the latest addition to my garage project. The prototype for this one was built in 1920. It probably didn't have overhead doors originally because overhead doors weren't invented until 1921. Notice also it has a chimney on it. Here's a carriage house from 1907 with proper carriage doors on it. I've done several repaints of this one for different color houses. And that's a modernized version of it with an overhead door. The real one has the insert like that because a modern overhead door is much smaller than the carriage doors that were used on it. And I think I may have even made them a little bit too tall, because if you compare it to the Ford Model T there and the buggy over there, it seems maybe a foot too tall, maybe. Because the man standing next to even the overhead door is not very tall next to it. I know the overhead door's measurements are correct, actually. Carriage doors, they fit the building and the scale that I know the building to be, but they still seem a little bit tall. I don't have the real measurements, that's part of the problem. I've made educated guesses. Now, here's the two-stall garage again. The white-doored version, the white-doored brown version, is the most authentic. It's as it would have been in 1976. The others are simply fictional repaints that are expedient for the house colors that you find in Auran Trainz. So here I'm putting the single-stall garage from the last video into place on the mainline project layout. The mainline project was really my reason for making all these garage models, because American-style car garages are hard to find in Auran Trainz, actually. If you go on the download station on the N3V website, you're going to have a lot of trouble finding them. You might find a few suburban homes with attached garages, but if you want to do steam-era stuff or steam-era houses in the modern era, you need separate garages generally. So I did some research and I made some models. There's one with an attached garage. That looks to be a European prototype. I am using it just because I want a little bit of a, I don't know, variety in these houses, because I ended up reusing a whole bunch of them and it just doesn't look so great. American-style houses, again, there are plenty of them for Auran Trainz, but the problem is, do they really fit the scene that you're trying to build, especially when you have a layout that's as big as this one. And if you notice, there's a lot of lag in the Surveyor. And this is because this is an extremely long layout. Ridiculously long. It's pushing 200 miles at this point. And even with the fastest train that I run on it, I've been able to do it in about 3.5 hours. So it is a very big layout. So there I'm taking another one of the single stall garages and rotating it into position. That's the one with the hoop, the basketball hoop. I featured this one in the previous video, so I've not really done any zooming in on it for this one. I figure if you want to see it, you can check out the other video. That garage is also in the other video. I think this one may have been originally a carriage house because it has a loft and it's associated with a house that was built in 1907. But that all depends on whether it was built at the time the house was built or afterward. Because if it was built enough years after, then it would have been a garage all along. But typically American garages don't have lofts. People, of course, routinely put boards over the rafters and use the attic, but it's usually not a proper loft, like with a window like you see there. It looks a lot like a carriage house, and it would be interesting to know if it ever was. I have not been able to determine that in my research. So anyway, I decided to do a double driveway for that one and for this one. This is the two-stall garage you saw earlier. from 1920 with the overhead doors that must have been added later. And I've added the basketball hoop that you saw in the last video. Again, off to the side of the driveway, because that's usually how these hoops are mounted if they're not mounted on the garage. And there you can see the single stall garage again. I decided not to reuse the blue version of it there, so I deleted it and I selected the blue wooden parts version of the carriage house. So I rotated that into place. Then I decided to do a large parking lot behind some of the larger houses, because you do sometimes see this in the United States, that if a larger house is subdivided into apartments, there will be a parking lot as opposed to just a garage, and sometimes the garage will be pretty big too. Maybe owned by the landlord or used for maintenance-related storage, anything like that. And of course, if it has a loft in it, you never know, it might be another cheap apartment in some cases. But I'm leaving that up to your imagination. The point is, I put a large parking lot behind these particular houses because it just seemed like a realistic touch. Now, of course, I've used only the texture there, as you can see, the asphalt texture, the most basic one from Auran Trainz, that unfortunately looks a little bit like gravel. But the reason I chose it was that a lot of these parking lots, especially in rural areas, are not necessarily in the best condition. So it could be crumbling asphalt, maybe mixed in with gravel almost. I didn't really want to use the parking lot spline for these. And of course I'm putting in the different garages I built, like the 2-stall and the 2-car, with the large door that I suspect was a carriage house. So there's the 2-car, single door, single stall. And then finally, I have a very small house, so I decided to use the modernized carriage house for it. And aligning it with the plain asphalt road spline there with no traffic. Took me a little bit of inching around. I had to lower all these splines because they're a little bit too tall and they tend to absorb the car tires. I was sort of being perfectionist about it, but I wanted it to look nice in close-ups. So there's the 2-stall garage again. Then another carriage house. And another. And then finally, I go back to the old 1-stall garage from the first video. And I'm rotating it into the correct position there. With the lag, this took a lot longer than you see here. And there's how the town looks with the garages in place. I think I could add some grades to the ground, but overall, I'm pretty pleased with how this turned out. Looks a lot better now with actual garages. So, thanks for watching, and watch this space.